Good day to you. Kind of noisy outside with that lawnmower. Let's take a walk in the woods. Yeah, it's one of the advantages of the pandemic. It's forcing us to revisit nature and to do things like taking a walk in the beautiful surroundings that are indicative of the Pocono region and Monroe County and New Jersey and really the greater Northeast. And there's more than just an exercise reason for taking a walk. Taking a walk used to be a way to ruminate. It used to be a way to think about the purpose of life, to think about the purpose of things. It was a way to philosophize, if you want to think of it that way. And so it's just perfect that today we're taking on the next element of a media system, which has to do with the philosophies that bring up a media system within a country. The philosophies being the purpose for a media system. What function is a media system going to perform? We don't just let media systems grow up in countries without guidance. Now, that's not been the history of mass media systems. Mass media systems grow up in countries and have a peculiar shape and form to them, not only because of cultural characteristics, which we got into last time, but now also taking on another element of the media system as a tree. We're looking at philosophies and how philosophies shape a media system. And this is the second area of looking at a media system as a tree that's still underground. We still need to dig down below the surface to get to philosophies. They're not easy to spot, just like cultural characteristics. So we're going to talk about philosophies now. We're going to go through 6 philosophies which have been used to guide media systems. That's right, media systems have been set up based on formal trains of thinking that are in the realm of philosophy. And the first one that we're going to start with is one that from today's vantage point, it's just easy to dismiss. It's the authoritarian philosophy. The authoritarian philosophy, which is a philosophy that we find perfectly acceptable for a time in our own families, right? Because that's what authoritarianism is all about. It's parents saying, I know better than my 14-year-old boy or girl, and so I'm going to impose some rules and restrictions, and if that child breaks those rules, like a curfew or hanging out with certain people or getting into certain activities, then the child is going to be punished rather harshly, things taken away from that child. We believe that parents have a certain role because of young people being naive, and it's similar to how authoritarianism operates at a country level when it comes to a media system. It's the idea that there is a ruler in a country, and that ruler usually has a connection to a deity, though not always. That ruler is a supreme, all-knowing being. Authoritarianism rose up in a different time period. That's why it's difficult to imagine how it could be a legitimate philosophy today. Authoritarianism grew up in the 1700s, and it followed the writings of Machiavelli and others. Actually, Plato is cited very often as one of the progenitors of authoritarianism. And it was for a time period in which countries didn't have healthcare systems. Countries were often at war with each other, and also within a country there was often a lot of division, and the U.S. had its own civil war. That's what I'm talking about. So authoritarianism grew up as a way to ensure that a country did not fall apart. And in order for a country to ensure that it did not fall apart due to a lot of external threats, disease, warring nations, health crises like pandemics, there had to be a belief and a belief in and an obedience to a ruler, a king, a queen, a priest, etc. This is how authoritarianism was set up. And so media operating in an authoritarian system, they can be privately owned. That's one of the unique features of an authoritarian system. Media are not owned by government. However, media are obedient to the state, and the purpose of media is primarily to serve the goals of the state. And the state has every interest in making sure that it does not collapse and that the people who are in power stay in power. So that's authoritarianism. The penalties are quite severe. Death, going missing, jail. These are all penalties for authoritarianism. Now let's take on the second philosophy. This philosophy grew up in opposition to authoritarianism. It's the libertarian philosophy. The libertarian philosophy coming mainly out of the writings of some British philosophers and British economists. Adam Smith, for example. And these people talked about the free market and how if you have a free market in the context of a democracy, then people are free to make the choices to determine their own destiny. And as long as they make responsible choices, then that is the preferred method of society operating, which is to say that government should have a very, very limited role in people's lives. Libertarian at its root means free. Liber is a Greek and Roman term meaning free. And so libertarianism is originally designed to mean freedom from government. Here in our country, we talk about libertarianism as a political party and a political philosophy. It basically means government out of everything except for the military. That's usually the way that libertarians conceptualize themselves. But in the context of media, it basically means that media should be private enterprise seeking operations, that they can be profit makers. Now, libertarianism in and of itself doesn't necessarily lend itself to free market economics. It mostly has to do with the role of government in people's private lives. But free market, the free market model of money making fits very nicely within libertarianism. So you've seen those two joined up, particularly in the United States and its media system, where almost all media are private profit-making entities. And that's not the case around the rest of the world, as we will discuss when we get deeper into the class. But for now, libertarianism is that philosophy that basically allows a corporate takeover, a money-making takeover of our mass media system. So kind of in response to that, we have our third philosophy that we're going to introduce now. It's a philosophy that you'll immediately have a bad taste about, probably. It's communism. Communism, coming mostly from the writings of Karl Marx and Frederick Engels in the Communist Manifesto. Communism is a philosophy that has a will of the government being imposed on the people. But again, it has a similarity to authoritarianism because the idea is that the government knows better than the people. The government has more educated people. The government has the people who live in the country's best interest in mind. And I've been to China, I've spoken to many communists, and to hear them explain it, they don't perceive that, I say they, I'm just stereotyping very generally, Chinese people don't perceive that they are being controlled. They don't perceive that there is a method of persuasion that's going on that prevents them from seeing alternative ways of looking at the world. They don't perceive that at all. They perceive it as the government will take care of them, and they're glad for that because the government has their best interests in mind. So under the communist philosophy, there is no other legitimate political party. The only legitimate political party is the Communist political party. So that's why it's the only one in power. And the Communist Party's political philosophy is designed to try, in the realm of media, to uplift the population's tastes rather than let them degrade due to coarsened or profane or questionable programming that demeans human beings. And so a lot of programming that comes from the West is just not allowed in China. A lot of really gritty programming, especially that's sexual or that shows prostitution and drug use. These are things that the Chinese government wants to keep out. And actually, when you walk around China, you don't see porn shops, you don't see even gas stations, you don't see pharmacies that much. China has a more natural view of the world. And so when it comes to what the government should promote through media, the government is more interested in promoting art forms and uplifting the Chinese taste for media content. And so the government actually insists on and pays for the melody opera to be a very common television program that's offered. The melody opera is an opera that has extreme ornamentation on the part of Chinese dress, and the melody opera has a tradition that dates back across centuries in China where morals to the story are told inside the Chinese opera. And so the opera has a historical and cultural significance that goes very deep, and the Chinese government wants to make sure that that is preserved and that this form of passing on meaning to people is present in the lives of Chinese people. And so you find Chinese and other communist governments, similarly in Russia, even though it's not purely communist, in Cuba, they are mandating that television content have the arts in it, symphonies and melody opera, as I mentioned there. So that wraps up communism. Now let's go on to the next philosophy, which actually was invented in the United States, but became more popular in Europe and still today exists in Europe in its really most pure form. And that is the philosophy called social responsibility philosophy, social responsibility philosophy. It was born by a professor, actually, at the University of Chicago right after World War II, Hutchins. Professor Hutchins was really disconcerted with the media coverage just after World War II. The media coverage was painting a very dark picture of the world by putting people into either the United States camp or the Soviet Union camp. It was called the First World and then the Second World for the Soviet Union world. And any other country that was small and didn't have a place, like Ecuador or Costa Rica, those countries were in the Third World. So I'm introducing this concept today to let you know that Third World is a very derogatory way to refer to countries. It doesn't even allow that they are in the First or the Second World, and it refers to them during a very old paradigm, and that was the Cold War. So at any rate, Professor Hutchins was very disturbed by this kind of media coverage, constantly getting people to be afraid of the Soviet Union, and also was disturbed by media coverage of Japanese people during the war. If you were to go to a movie theater, you would very often see a trailer to start off the movie, or prior to the movie, that was a cartoon, and the title of it was Kill a Jap Today. And, the Japanese, they attacked Pearl Harbor, but to kill a Jap today is a different level of urging of violence against an entire race of people. So Professor Hutchins was not too keen on that, and he put together a commission. And that commission was called the Social Responsibility Commission, and that commission developed a set of guidelines for how media should operate. And it borrows from libertarianism insofar as it says, okay, the government should not be controlling media. However, if the playing field is not level, if there is unfairness, then the government gets to step in. Then the government gets to say, okay, this company is enacting monopolistic tendencies in its advertising, pricing, and so we're going to fine that company. Or this company is operating without meeting other regulations, that broadcaster is going to be fined. That's the way that the government should work under a social responsibility system. It's kind of a referee throwing the yellow flag on the field only when the players, the competitors, are not performing in a fair manner. So social responsibility also has as part of its way of making change, because the idea is to get broadcasters and other media publishers to be fairer and to be more objective, is to list a set of guidelines that media should be following. So, for example, some guidelines, I'm trying to make my way around this guy with a weed whacker. Some guidelines call for broadcasters to provide a balanced point of view. So, for example, if you're covering an abortion protest in town, the average broadcaster is going to try and find at some point, average journalist I should say, the opinion of somebody who opposes the abortion protest, so that you have a balanced point of view. Now that's a kind of a simple way of looking at the world, because there can be 3 and 4 opinions, especially when it comes to abortion, which has many nuances. But generally speaking, that's how social responsibility works. Another dimension of social responsibility theory is to say, let those countries that are being covered be covered by people from those countries. If you're going to go down and cover Venezuela, which is a country that is often portrayed very negatively in our news, then let a Venezuelan be the person who's reporting on that country. So this is the way that social responsibility philosophy operates. Now, I say that it has been adopted mostly in Europe, and that's because Europe has decided that there needs to be a safeguard on commercialism in the media. And so if you go to Europe, you'll find that any member of the European Union, the EU, has to abide by an additional set of media regulations that call for them to limit the number of minutes of advertising, for example. We've already talked about that in this class, minutage, that's what that's called. And there are other restrictions as well that, for example, when it comes to violence and airing graphic violence with even bones cracking and other kinds of descriptions that are in the codes of regulations, you cannot do that. In Europe, it's seen as being socially responsible, not getting people used to death as a routine and thereby being desensitized to it. Okay, so that's social responsibility philosophy. Now we're going to go on to the two remaining philosophies. Both of these are newer philosophies. They're not as well developed in terms of being based on a body of literature and a body of research, but they are very interesting. And so the next one we're going to talk about is called the developmental philosophy. The developmental philosophy is specifically for those countries that are developing countries, the countries that we would have previously called third world countries. These are developing countries. These are small countries. These are countries that have had ethnic strife. These are countries that are exposed to really severe weather conditions that can wipe the country out with hurricanes or droughts. These are countries that can be very arid. They don't have the ability to grow a lot. They have deserts and climates that don't lend themselves to being able to grow, or sorry, I should say soil composition that don't lead them to be able to grow much in them. These are the kinds of countries, they're vulnerable countries, they're developing countries. They need some assistance, especially if they have one product that their country is based on very much, like bananas, and then bananas goes bad, something happens, there's a disease, an infection, bananas can't be produced, that country has a big problem. So developing countries have a philosophy that's applied to them that says that the media should help the country develop. But in turn, the government should help the media help the country develop. So the media are reliant upon the government and the government are reliant upon the media, but they have a higher goal than just making money or educating the population. The purpose under a developmental system is to try and build the country up, to help it establish its infrastructure of highways and bridges and water systems, to help it raise its level of education, to eradicate polio and other kinds of diseases that have been eradicated in other parts of the world, to raise education so that kids are not leaving school at the age of 12 and 13 and going to work, that they are getting educated. This is what a developmental system is about, but media in a developmental system needs support as well. You don't just start a television station. If you want to start a cable network in the United States, it takes you like 20 years before the return on the investment starts coming back in because of the massive layout that's needed for the infrastructure of the cable. And the same goes on a different scale for television. You want to start a television station, you can't just do that. You have to have educated, trained reporters. You have to have directors, producers. You have to have the technology to deliver television content and radio and newspapers and so on and so on. So media in developing countries, they need the support of government. They need the support of government in the form of grants, in the form of training programs, in the form of transportation in some cases to get media product to places. The government can provide train service for that. So government helps media. Media helps government. Media need government to be accessible and transparent. If there's a problem, the media need to be able to report on corruption. If somebody's being bribed to get a highway contract and they're a government official and the contractor is paying this government official on the side to then award the contract to the contractor, unfairly and compared to other people put in bids, that needs to be rooted out. The government can't hide that. The government needs to be open with its laws, with its records, with its meetings. This is the relationship that ideally should exist in a developmental media system, a developmental philosophy where the government relies on the media and the media rely on the government to both of them together build a country up and to have that country progress along with the health and the welfare of its people. And now that takes us to our final philosophy. This is a philosophy that got born in the United States mostly because of common citizens using their phones and the internet. And this final philosophy is called democratic participant philosophy. Democratic participant philosophy. It's the idea that prior to social media, prior to YouTube, prior to all the apps that you have on your phone that get you, it could be anything from Vimeo to Facebook, to Twitter, to TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn, whatever you're using to go on and communicate with others in the world, primarily because of that, today, the stranglehold that big companies and organizations used to have on distributing media content has been broken. Think about it. If you wanted to call a press conference today because you don't like the parking situation at ESU, who's showing up? Not many people, unless you're seen as an important person. You have a title, or you're a parking official, or you're from out of state and you're here to investigate it as part of the FBI. Those kinds of things, that'll get you a press conference. But if you're an ordinary person, no. And apply that also to creating content. You want to create a radio song, you want to create television content, you want to create your own newspaper column. It's really hard under the old model. But now telephones, cell phones, laptops, tablets, all the software that goes along with them have given the average citizen the ability to create content and distribute it on YouTube, on Facebook Live, through text, through posts, through all manner and means that you have at your disposal on your phone. And okay, yeah, it's really hard to get content to go viral. That's very, very difficult. But sometimes it happens and you have an impact. The revolution in Egypt that overthrew the president was called the Facebook Revolution. Now that's been somewhat disputed, but it's interesting, is it not, that revolution would have not taken place if it were not for Facebook. And so at your hands today is a whole new way of democratic citizen participation, because that's what a democracy depends on. A democracy depends on each and every person having an equal opportunity to participate in the decision making, to participate through voting, which we all have the opportunity to do. Not all of us take up that opportunity. To have the opportunity through public forums, I think that's the plural of that word, through media, on social media, making posts that can be seen by others that are public posts, going to town hall meetings, if that's your situation, standing up in your classroom at a university, speaking at a school board meeting, speaking with other parents, speaking with neighbors. This is what democracy depends on. So the cell phone has given rise to the last and final philosophy that countries are using to frame what their media should do, and that is called democratic citizenship participation. Some places like Sweden, you have an automatic mandated public Wi-Fi that you don't have to pay for just because it's a public service. By being in the city of Malmo, one of the biggest cities in the south of Sweden, you automatically get Wi-Fi. You don't have to sign in with a password. You don't have to do a free trial. You don't have to be with a provider already. You just get Wi-Fi. It's part of the government's insistence that people have equal access to decision-making and to conversation and communication. That's what the cell phone has done in this age, is given us this new philosophy called democratic democratic participant philosophy. So there you have it, 6 philosophies. Neither one is operating solely in a country. a country very typically borrows 2 or 3 philosophies and different bits and pieces from it. You could say that in the US we have a libertarian philosophy. We also have a social media responsibility philosophy. You could say that that's present in our country, but you can also say that we have an authoritarian philosophy. And again, to illustrate that, after 9/11, the Patriot Act was passed. The Patriot Act gives the government the right to tap your phone every time you make a call overseas to somebody in another country. Your phone can be tapped by the National Security Agency. So that's an authoritarian measure. So when we look at philosophies, we're looking at which ones are operating in which context in a country, and it really helps us understand how a media system is set up to serve a certain function or purpose. Have a great day.